Hello there, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me at least. Unfortunately, I'm having a few issues with webcams today, so apologies for that because I've actually gone to the expense of putting on a cleanly ironed shirt for you all. Today we're going to have a presentation on desktop water and effluent audits, and sort of a position where you can kind of start on your water efficiency journey. Today the presentation is going to be by Dave Bryden, who's our Chief Auditor. And he's going to take you through the slides. I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping to start with. So everybody is on mute to start with. We do that out of experience. We've done quite a few of these, and if we leave them open and people sort of talk or there's background noise, it can become a bit disorientating. So we hope you don't mind us doing that. The other thing is as well, we've got on the sort of, it's normally on the right hand side of your screen, you'll notice a black box with an orange arrow, and that jumps in and out. So if you want to hide the question bars, you can, and you can pop it back out by pressing the same thing. There is a question section in there, so if you do have any questions, please just type them in, and what I'll do is I'll ask Dave those questions at the end of the presentation to get you those answers. If anybody's got a particular burning need to want to come on and ask a question live, just put that in the question box as well, and what I'll do at the end is I'll introduce you and I'll unmute your microphone, and hopefully everything will work perfectly smoothly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to transfer my screen over to Dave so you can see the presentation, and Dave is going to take you through the presentation.
Okay, well, thanks, Andy. Is that screen visible? Can you see that, Andy?
Yes, I can, Dave.
Excellent. Okay, right. Let's begin. So thanks very much, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well. Thanks for taking the time to listen to the webinar today. I hope you find it interesting. This is what I'm going to talk about, which is desktop audits. It might be a phrase that you've not heard before, so I'll start off by talking about just exactly what they are, what they do, and then how they can be used to review your water, your wastewater, and if you have trade effluent consents, or if you're a manufacturer, how they can be used to review effluent management and surface water management. What you'll see, particularly in the subtitle there underneath desktop audit, it says preliminary. You'll hear me use lots of words like preliminary or first cut or high level. Desktop audits are exactly that. They're a first cut assessment, and effectively they're a bit like a scoping study. They're a sort of prelude to a more detailed study. And the real benefit of desktop audits is helping you to set the scope for any water efficiency, effluent work, or billing evaluations, or surface water management work. And the desktop audit procedure that we use it's very systematic, it's very structured, and it's repeatable, and it's auditable. So it's applicable to any sort of facility, whether you've got a single premises, it's ideal for that. It's really useful if you are, for example, a council, or you work in the NHS and you've got a big estate with a large portfolio of sites. You can get a real sort of like-for-like comparison between water efficiency and wastewater and aspects of effluent management across the whole portfolio of your estate. So if we move on to the content, what I'm going to talk about, I'll start off by talking about what it covers and what the scope of the audit is. So what does it include? What level of detail does it go into? What exactly do we do during the audit, and what is needed from yourselves, from the customers? And I'll then move on to what the benefits are of a desktop audit. Now, as I've said, this sort of audit is a first cut, high level preliminary assessment of opportunities for looking at water efficiency. I've mentioned effluent. If you are a trade effluent customer, if you have a trade effluent consent, it covers effluent management. Some people have surface water management costs within their billing, or they have surface water management issues on site. It can help you to look at those as well. It's also an opportunity to highlight areas where things such as the improved water efficiency or effluent treatment can actually be physically achieved on the site. So it can help you look at specific areas to focus and prioritize your effluent and water efforts. So clearly, one potential benefit is cost reduction. That's a very clear benefit that can come out of this. Unfortunately, we can't always guarantee that there will be cost savings to be made. Sometimes you get to a site or you do an audit and you find out that actually the site's really efficient. But that in itself can be a result, that the fact that you are actually operating as well as you can as far as water efficiency goes. But there are a number of very valuable spin-off benefits, and that can be things such as the assessment of your charges and tariffs. Are you on the right tariff? Is it being applied correctly? And I've got a case study about that later in the presentation. Do you have the potential to capture rainwater? A lot of people are asking about this now. I've been asked a lot about this over the last 6 months or so. Can rainwater be captured? If so, how much? What could I use it for? What are the cost benefits of doing that? Does it look like you have the scope to reduce any effluent costs? That's covered by the audit as well. What are the opportunities for water efficiency? Where could you put in more water efficient equipment? What could that equipment look like? What would it be? What would the cost benefits of that be? Do any real problems leak out of the data? And again, I've got a case study coming up where there was a real problem that leaked out of the data. And in fact, it's one of my favorite ever case studies ever, because the payback in it was completely instantaneous. But I'll talk about all of this a bit later on, and I'll illustrate each point with a case study. And a desktop audit can take place with a surprisingly small amount of information. So I'll talk about the information that you need to carry out the audit. And bearing in mind that this is just a preliminary assessment, typically we would start with billing information. If you have any water meters on site, water meter readings or water data logger readings are ideal. They're really useful for this sort of thing. But also things like water supply agreements, some indication of staffing numbers or other usage on site is really useful. And we have a standard questionnaire that we send out when we start doing this sort of audit. So all of this sort of thing is standardized. That helps customers to see exactly what sort of information they need to compile. Sometimes they've already done that. And it helps us to do a like-for-like comparison if we repeat this across a number of other sites. I've mentioned trade effluent a couple of times. If you have a trade effluent agreement, a trade effluent consent, it's always really useful to see that and to see what sort of limits and levels are within that. So we don't need a lot to do this sort of first cut assessment, but a quick high-level evaluation of a small amount of the right data can really pinpoint potential savings and other opportunities. And it's very, very useful as a scoping study to make sure that you can focus your effort in the right places. Now, the audits, what they actually deliver is a concise, but it's a pretty comprehensive report that sets out the scope of the potential savings, what the opportunities are, and more importantly, in a way, it sets out at a high level how you could start to plan to realise whatever benefits come out of the audit. The length of the report depends on the amount of data and the size of the site that we're being looked at. It could vary between maybe 4 sides of A4 and 10 sides of A4. So it's a short, concise status report, effectively, about water-related aspects of your site. Now, there is a caveat with this. As I've said, we can't guarantee savings. I wish I could. But what the desktop audit might reveal is that there's little or no scope for savings, but you are actually operating at a really water efficient level. And as I say, sometimes that can be a result in itself. I've got to be honest, it's very rare to come across a site where that actually happens, where there's no scope at all for savings. There's usually some scope somewhere. And quite often, the report can help you to focus and pinpoint exactly where they are. So let's have a look at in a bit more detail at what the audits actually cover. So again, there's that word preliminary. It's a high-level preliminary assessment. If the organisation you're working in, whether you're local, you would do quite possibly is gather together billing information, talk to a utilities manager, talk to an engineering manager, and start to do this sort of collation exercise and form in your own minds exactly what it is you're looking at and what the opportunities might be and where you really need to concentrate your efforts. And it's not unusual to do this sort of audit, speak to the customers and find out that they've got one idea of where they think they need to concentrate on water efficiency, for example. But actually, when you get into the detail of the audit, you find there's a better opportunity somewhere else. So in simple terms, it's effectively a way of getting more bang for your buck. It's a way of understanding exactly where the bigger opportunities lie and helping you to rank those opportunities. So the intention of the audit is really to show you where those opportunities could lie and help you to focus on them. But later in the presentation, I'll talk about data and the information we need to do this sort of audit. But it starts with analysing billing information. We'll review your water bills, see if we can determine any trends. Has consumption changed over time? Can those changes be explained? What was the change in cost associated with those changes in consumption? Has it increased cost? Has it decreased them? And we'll look at your tariffs and the charging calculations. Now, it's quite possible that a customer can be on the correct tariff, but sometimes the charging calculations that implement that tariff can be wrong. And I've got a case study coming up where a customer received quite a nice rebate because although they were on the correct tariff, some of the calculations were incorrect in the bills for 1 year. So what I'll also look as well at is we'll check for billing mistakes, and we can do that for water, and where customers have these, look at trade effluent consents and surface water charges. Now, I've mentioned trade effluent and surface water a few times. It's probably worth just explaining what they are if you're not familiar with them. If you produce any sort of wastewater on your site and it's not domestic in origin, and you want to put that to a public sewer for treatment at the local sewage works, then that is called trade effluent. And it's typically produced by manufacturers, but some local authorities have them. So for example, local authorities that manage swimming pools sometimes have them for the backwash from the swimming pool, or if they have depots where they wash vehicles, for example, that requires what's called a trade effluent consent. The consent is a physical document that gives you permission to discharge that material to the sewer. If you discharge it even to the sewer without having that consent, that is illegal. You are not allowed to discharge trade effluent to a public sewer unless you've actually got permission to do so. And not only do you need that permission, there is also a charging mechanism which is used to work out how much you pay to have your trade effluent discharged to a sewer. And quite often there can be savings to be made by changing the way effluent is managed and treated on a site, or perhaps asking for variations in your consent, which could perhaps work in your favour. Excuse me. Surface water, some sites have large areas which collect surface water, which subsequently drains to a public sewer, and that is part of the billing mechanism. The way in which surface area is calculated is sometimes not correct. Many years ago, I used to do this when I worked somewhere else, and even now, 20 years later, it's often a case of just drawing rectangles on a map and working out what the area is. And sometimes the areas on your surface water bills are not correct. So we will check those to see if the areas are correct. We'll also use that information to look, as I'll talk about a little bit later, at the potential for capturing rainwater. But the whole point of the audit is to do two things. One is to check for cost savings, and the other one is to look at a preliminary assessment of other opportunities for increasing water efficiency. So let's have a very quick case study. I don't have a slide for this one, unfortunately, but this one's from an industrial client. Their trade effluent charges were based on a particular composition of effluent going to a sewer. And they had discharged this material to the sewer for 10 years. They had a very good set of data which set out exactly what the composition of that material was. A couple of years ago, they received a bill which was analysed as part of the desktop audit, and they had been moved on to what's called a fixed strength charging mechanism. Now, they hadn't noticed this. They didn't know this had happened. They'd been given no notification of it, and they'd gone onto this fixed strength charging mechanism, and it had greatly increased their costs. And the reason it had greatly increased their costs is because the water company who had managed the trade effluent, which wasn't Northumbrian water, I hasten to add, had taken a very small number of samples, worked out an average composition, and then assumed that average composition would apply for the forthcoming 12 months. I'm going to quote some figures that they may or may not mean something to you unless you're familiar with trade effluent, but the COD, the chemical oxygen demand of their effluent over 10 years on average was about 5,000 milligrams per litre. The new figure, which was applied to their fixed strength bill, was over 22,000 milligrams per litre. And that was the source of this massive increase in trade effluent costs. The recommendation that came out of the audit was to challenge this, was to go back to the water company and challenge it and say, look, we've got 10 years worth of data which demonstrates very clearly what we think the composition is. We've done nothing differently in the last 12 months. Please, can you explain? I think our trade effluent is now over 20,000 milligrams per litre. And that challenge was successful. And they actually received quite a decent rebate on their trade effluent costs. And that all came from looking through bills as part of a desktop audit. And that is one of the examples of where this systematic, repeatable, structured procedure can really help to uncover savings which might have been missed. So that's effectively what the audits do, what the audits cover. I've talked a little bit about savings. Let's have a look in a little bit more detail at where the benefits are and what the benefits could be. So you get a concise summary of your water efficiency status. And as I've mentioned, it could include effluent, could include surface water as well. It's comprehensive. It's a quick process. If the data comes back in a relatively standardized form, then turnaround for getting this sort of assessment out is fairly quick. Now, I've said 2 days there, and it's often dangerous to put a figure like that up in a presentation. Sometimes it can be longer. It depends on the size of the site it's in. If we get billing data in a spreadsheet format, then the analysis of that is generally pretty quick. Lots of cardboard boxes by courier with several years worth of paper bills in, which obviously takes a lot longer to give you more impetus to water-related projects. I think one thing that we all understand is that water is a lower cost utility compared to electricity and gas and fuel, and sometimes it slips down the agenda, even though it's a very important thing to consider. And this rapid turnaround can really help to give you some impetus to water-related. The other benefit is, obviously, it identifies the realistic opportunities. It's very easy to go into a site and opportunity you see without actually ranking them and pointing out which ones are the better ones to go for. So we will list all the opportunities that we find within the desktop audit and within the data that's provided, but we'll then give you an assessment of which are the most realistic ones and which ones are going to give the better return. And this helps you to prioritize effort in the right places. It also helps to set meaningful targets as well. So there's a very quick case study about meaningful targets. A number of months ago, I did a desktop audit for a very large office block, which had about 3,000 people in it. They had a KPI, key performance indicator, for water efficiency in the building, and they wanted to be one of the most water efficient offices in the country. So they'd set a target of 35 litres per person per day for this office. This target was causing quite a lot of agitation amongst the engineering managers, the utilities managers, and the environmental manager within the organisation. And that was because sometimes they met the target, sometimes they were operating at about 34 litres per head, sometimes they didn't meet the target, they were operating at about 36. So in simple terms, comparing their water efficiency with this arbitrary target was causing them some consternation. One of the things that came out of the audit was, actually, if you look at the history and the available data about this sort of office, it's realistic to apply a range of key performance indicators rather than a fixed target. So what came out of the audit was that the range, or the envelope, if you like, of water efficiency should be somewhere between about 34 litres per person per day to about 42. And what that meant was that the client then understood that actually aiming for this single KPI hadn't really been realistic, and it was causing them to lose focus. They were concentrating more on achieving a single number, and they were losing focus on the other water efficiency aspects of their site. So when we say we identify realistic opportunities and it helps you to set meaningful targets, that's the sort of thing that we're looking for. And we do put quite a lot of store by analysing the variability in your data to understand exactly what those variations mean and whether they can be with, or whether it's best sometimes just to leave them and manage them. So the whole point of the exercise really is to give customers a status report about water efficiency and to help identify where and how the water efficiency can be improved. And we want the audits to be as useful as possible. And clearly that's based on the data that we've got, but we put a lot of effort into making sure that the opportunities we come up with are real and they're tangible and they're manageable and they're going to be beneficial to the customers. That's what it's all about. So this means you can use the audit report to prioritise any future work on water or effluent or surface water on your site. So for example, there could be anecdotal information on the site that one particular area needs to be examined closely, but the audit might uncover another opportunity elsewhere that will bring greater benefits. And that's the type of conclusion that helps you to focus effort where it's needed the most. So what do we need to actually do the audit? And you'll see there the subtitle says maximising the usefulness of the existing information. A lot of the information that we use in a desktop audit is stuff which is used maybe for reporting key performance indicators, but maybe nothing else. It might be used to plot the odd trend graph, and one of the case studies shows that. But sometimes there's a lot more information that can be extracted from it, and that's one of the benefits of the audit, is showing you where and how that information can be extracted. So typically we need sort of 5 categories of information. We don't need all of them. Some of them don't apply to all sites. Some sites have some, but not others. And we're very adept at making the best use of whatever the available information is. And although this is a systematic, structured procedure, it is flexible as well, and it can be cut to fit whatever the data is available. And the audits need information which is actually fairly commonplace, he says, touching wood. So the clients who would like us to carry out an audit don't really have to expend too much effort compiling the things we need. And we often find it's already been done already in some form or other. So within financial functions within an organisation, there is often somebody who has already collated water bills. Engineering managers have already collated drawings or descriptions of manufacturing processes or descriptions of maintenance procedures. A lot of that already exists. And as I say, we issue a standard questionnaire which sets out ideally what we need. We need to see at least 12 months of water bills and ideally 3 years worth. And the reason for that is that the more data we've got about water consumption and water billing, the better it is for examining longer term trends. If you've got meter readings or if you've got automated meter loggers, as I said earlier, those things are absolutely ideal. Reading some of those are excellent for looking at this sort of assessment, and they can be very powerful tools for this sort of audit. If you're a manufacturer and have a trade effluent consent, then the bills that come with that and some idea of the consent limits are needed as well. And regardless of what your site does, a brief description of how water is used on site is also very useful. So for an office block, it will generally be for domestic purposes, plus perhaps kitchens and canteens. For manufacturing companies, it could be heating, cooling, washing, and incorporating into products. So some description of that is also included on the questionnaire. And again, we don't need a huge description, as long as we can understand exactly what goes on. And bearing in mind that this is a desktop audit, it doesn't involve, in the first instance, coming to site. It just helps us to understand exactly what you do. So we take that information, and one of the things we do is we have quite a sophisticated procedure to take things like estimates of staff numbers and turn them into predicted consumption patterns that we can then compare with benchmarks. Excuse me. And this can help to show you savings that can be made by changing, for example, equipment such as systems or tap mechanisms or showers or pressure washer settings or pressure reducing valves. And they can be very useful for showing where the financial savings can potentially lie. And it can also be quite useful for setting a pattern or a plan for how that work could be done in the future. So if you want to, say, for example, change all the systems in one go, this will show you or give you an idea where you can do that. Or is it worth changing some taps now and then leaving others till later? Drawings are really useful, particularly if they show site drainage, but they're not essential. Some years ago, I did this sort of audit for a very large automotive company, and they were being charged quite a lot of money for surface water to drain to the public sewer. They provided a drawing, which was an absolutely huge beast, really complex drawing. And in one corner of the drawing, you could see that there was a surface water sewer, which was actually going to a local water course. So a portion of their surface water didn't actually go to the sewer. It went out to the water course and didn't trouble the public sewer at all. And it was by analysing those drawings that I was able to help the client to get a rebate on surface water charges, which was a very welcome rebate for them. So drawings can be very useful. We do understand, though, that some sites don't have drawings, or sometimes the drawings are very old. And one of the things that can come out of the audit are recommendations about, if you have old drawings, or even if you don't have drawings, is recommending where they can be updated or where drawings should be created. When it comes to things like surface water or rainfall capture, we can use Google Earth actually to estimate surface areas. Just before Christmas, I did an audit at a place in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I compared the measurements from a scale drawing done in AutoCAD with some measurements that I took from the same site in Google Earth, and they were actually very, very comparable. And to give you an example, one particular building was on the AutoCAD drawing marked down as 17.5 meters long, and on Google Earth I measured it as about 16.75, which for the purposes of a desktop audit, that difference in length didn't really make too much difference. If you're doing finer work, obviously you need better measurements, but the point is that for this sort of assessment, Google Earth is actually surprisingly accurate. As I've mentioned a couple of times, at the start of every audit, we issue a questionnaire, and that lists what we need. It helps us to standardise the work, and it helps to make it repeatable. So as I've said, if you've got a large portfolio of estates, or it's a large site split up into separate blocks, for example, like a hospital, then it's ideal for doing a like-for-like comparison between those parts of the site or those different buildings. One part of the questionnaire asks you to describe briefly if you have any aspirations for water efficiency or effluent management, for cost savings on site. And the reason we ask for that is to understand, firstly, what your feelings are. Do you just generally want to reduce water efficiency, or to find out if there are specific items you want us to look at? It's also very useful for understanding if, in the nicest possible way, the aspirations are realistic. I recently did some work for, again, it was another large office block, where they had an aspirational water efficiency, which, when you got into the detail of how that site operated, it wasn't really that realistic to achieve. So this can also help to set, as I mentioned earlier, manageable targets for you to look at. And we don't actually need much more than that. It's probably taken longer to talk about it than I thought it would. It's data that's commonly available. If you've got all of it, that's absolutely fantastic. If you don't have all of it, that's not a problem. We can fill in the blanks, or we can tailor the audit to suit, and we can still give you real tangible conclusions from the end of it. And this will produce the preliminary assessment of your performance, particularly against benchmarks where they're available, and what the opportunities are for water efficiency. So, what exactly do we do with your data? Well, when we look at billing data, we check that you're on the correct tariff, like I've mentioned before. Oh, there we go. We check you're on the correct tariff. And if that tariff, you might be aware that the water market for non-household customers opened up for retail 2 or 3 years ago. It's widely recognised within the industry that there have been billing problems. I think a lot of people know that. And mistakes on bills do happen. There are hundreds of thousands of bills that are issued by water companies every year, and even though large parts of that process are standardized, unfortunately mistakes do happen. So we will look at your bill and we will make sure that your tariff is correct and it has been applied correctly. So the distinction there is that sometimes water companies have different tariffs depending on your annual consumption. If you're on the border between two, then we can help you choose or make sure that you're on the right one. It could be that you dramatically increased or decreased consumption and you now fall into a different tariff bracket, which could be more beneficial for you. So we'll do that part, that sort of thing as part of the assessment. And then we'll look to make sure the mechanics of the calculations are actually correct as well. One thing that we look at as well, and I mentioned consumption patterns. If you have effluent volume data is fantastic. Any numerical data which shows how consumption changes over time is very, very useful. And if that comes in spreadsheet form, we can plot graphs of that, as sometimes it arrives in graph format. And we can do some statistical analysis on that to look at these patterns and try to work out at a high level if any changes are realistic. Is it just natural variation in the data, or has there actually been a step change in consumption? And that can then help out to pinpoint when things have happened, how long things have been going on for, and then you can then burrow down perhaps separately from the desktop audit and work out exactly why these changes have occurred. And as I said, my favorite ever case study in the world is based on exactly that sort of analysis. Where we can, and we can't always do this because it depends on the data, is really burrow down into that consumption data, particularly if you've got automated meter readings or if you have sub-meters. Now, a lot of premises just have a single meter on the incoming feed into the building, and that's it. But some sites do have sub-meters around the site, so you can then look at different consumption patterns in different parts of the site. As a very quick case study, many, many years ago, I did this sort of study with one of the UK port authorities, who has a lot of sub-meters and a lot of data, which took a long time to go through. But what that enabled that port authority to do was to look at each of the tenants within their site boundary and understand which ones were the biggest water consumers. And they could then go around and understand if that was fair use, if that was a fair use of the water within the boundary, or if some of the tenants could perhaps be more water efficient. As I say, you can't always do that because it depends on the data and depends whether you've actually got sub-meters. But a lot of very good insight can come from a quick analysis of this sort of trends. We differentiate between billing data and site data. Now, billing data and things like that are obviously numerical. These are consumption figures. It might be meter readings, it can be costs, they're numbers. But the site data is slightly different. Some of it is mundane things like numbers of staff or the numbers of fixtures and fittings that you've got within a particular site. And as I said, we run through those with a fairly rigorous analysis tool. And that shows you how your current consumption compares to scenarios where you might install more water efficient equipment. So that could be low flush toilets, or it could be more water efficient taps, or if you're a manufacturing company, it could be by using water in a different way within manufacturing processes, or by managing effluent or surface water in a different way. And what that does is that gives you good auditable estimates of the savings you could make by changing fixtures and fittings or by changing operating processes. And this really helps to make it clear if there are actually opportunities there and roughly how big those opportunities are. It might be the case that you have a huge office block, thousands of people in there, and by making changes to the types of fixtures and fittings in the toilet facilities, you can make big changes. those changes or those savings might be much smaller if your site is smaller. So we can help you to understand where the opportunities are. Now, aside from that sort of information, our work takes us to many, many types of establishment, whether that's commercial, leisure, or manufacturing sites. And this means we can give you very good, high quality advice about general water efficiency or effluent management or surface water management for a very wide range of businesses. I've personally done this sort of audit and much more detailed work in sites ranging from leisure centres to oil refineries, or the NHS and local council estate portfolios to food manufacturers or sports stadia. So even if it's an industry or a sector we've not worked in, we can still use our experience in those other sectors to give you some really good high quality general advice about how you can ensure water efficiency. Now, I've mentioned rainwater harvesting and surface water management a couple of times. Those things are becoming increasingly popular. The two are slightly different. Rainwater harvesting is about collecting rainwater to reuse elsewhere. Surface water management tends to be about managing water that falls onto things like car parks and then drains into a sewer. And many companies are interested in assessing what the benefits are of capturing and reusing rainwater. A few years ago, I did a rainwater harvesting audit at a school in Sunderland, and what I found was that on the day that I went there, it was absolutely lashing down. So there was tons of rainwater going into the tank, but they also had a top-up valve which topped up the tank with fresh mains water for occasions when there was no rain falling at all. And when I did the audit on site, it backed up what I'd seen in the desktop audit, which was there was actually more water going into the tank than what there should have been. And it's because the valve and the float switch on the valve from the mains was broken. So they were literally taking water from the mains, it was going into the rainwater tank, and then it was overflowing and going down the drain. So they were almost literally throwing water down the drain. And that trend had been picked up in the data, in the billing data, but it wasn't apparent to the school. So that's one aspect of how this sort of desktop audit can help you look at rainwater harvesting. We can assess that very quickly. All we need is your address, the postcode. As I said, we can use Google Earth. We've got access to very good sources of rainfall data, both within the Met Office and outside of that, some of which can be very specific to very specific locations. And the procedure we use is based on a standard rainwater harvesting procedure within the British Standard 8515, and this gives an accurate estimate of the volume of rainfall you could potentially capture, but more importantly, what you could do with it. And we can give you an assessment, if that's what you'd like, of the likely cost of the system to do that. So, for example, I worked on sites where councils have used this sort of system to wash the wheels of refuse vehicles or recycling lorries. And I mentioned the school there who were using it and treating it to flush toilets for non-potable water use. And I've worked with manufacturers who've used it to capture water that can then be used in their cooling systems or for washdowns. So it's certainly perfectly possible to do it, and we can give you a quick assessment of that. And what you get from this part of the analysis are approximate costs and some idea of the payback that you can get for changing equipment, whether that's to install water efficient equipment, change manufacturing practices, or maybe capture rainwater. So what do we deliver? What actually comes out of this? The end result of the desktop audit is the report. That's what we deliver. And as I said earlier, this is not a highly detailed assessment. It's not an engineering feasibility study. It's essentially a form of scoping study. So the report we deliver is concise, but at the same time it's comprehensive. It covers all of the things that I've just talked about, but without being burdened with too much detail. And it's almost like a longer version of an executive summary that you get in the front of a larger report. But what I'd just like to stress is this desktop audit is the prelude to a more detailed scoping study. or it can be the prelude to a more detailed scoping study. It's what helps you to understand where the opportunities are and where you can focus and prioritise your effort. So the report summarises all of the things I've mentioned. It will look at your water consumption and, where possible, compare that with benchmark data for similar sites. It will give you an indication of how favourably your site compares with similar sites. And this enables you to decide if the findings of the report need further action within your organisation, or if you might be quite happy with it. It might be that your objective for getting a desktop audit done is simply to get that assessment, and that might fulfil your needs. Or if you want to look at where further work could be done, your report can help you point you in the right direction. So, for example, if the analysis says your consumption is substantially higher than a similar benchmark for a similar site, you might then want to understand why, and you might then want to go into a more detailed period of analysis. So the benchmark analysis is one part of framing the need for where you want to go in the future. We'll summarise these other opportunities, both financial and more infrastructure based, and you'll receive a concise but detailed assessment of things like rainwater harvesting potential, like I've already mentioned, and trade effluent management. And then we'll round this off with our commentary and our recommendations about what could be done next at your site. And as I said, some customers say the report is exactly what we needed. We just wanted a status report. That's all we needed. But some clients say, this has highlighted things that we really want to look at in more detail in the future. So it's not a highly detailed in-depth study, but it's a first look at how such a study could be scoped out, or even if one is actually needed at all. So let's move into some case studies. This is quite a simple billing one. This client was on a 2-tier tariff, which isn't the easiest thing to say. But below a certain annual consumption, they paid one specific rate. So that was one rate per cubic metre of water that they abstracted from the mains. Above a particular threshold, they should have paid a lower rate. And the threshold was something like 8,500 cubic metres a year. But as part of the desktop audit, what was noticed was that the second rate hadn't been applied in one particular year. It had the year before, for several years before, and it was for several years afterwards, but there was one particular year when it hadn't been applied, and there was no reason for that. The client hadn't actually noticed this. This was challenged, and it actually led to a rebate of about £5,000 for that particular customer. It was a rebate they didn't realise they were entitled to because they hadn't actually analysed the billing data in enough detail to understand that although the tariff was correct, the charging calculation was not correct for that one particular year. And it was simply just down to, from what I can remember, it was human error. And as I said, these mistakes happen, but this is one of the mistakes that a desktop audit can help to uncover. I wish they were all like this. Unfortunately, they're not, but it can be picked up by the audit. This one's an effluent one. I've mentioned trade effluent quite a few times. Quite a lot of trade effluent customers can make some quite decent savings by looking in more detail at how they manage effluent, whether they need to treat it or what their billing is. So this client was billed on the assumption that all of the water that they took from the mains was then discharged back to the sewer as trade effluent. That is sometimes referred to as 100% return to sewer, which is rarely the case, but sometimes what the companies might make an allowance to say, well, we'll assume that 95% of what you take goes back to the sewer. The other 5% is lost as domestic use or evaporative losses in heating and cooling systems. Now, this particular client was very clear that 100% of what they took from the mains was not discharged back to the sewer. What came out of the desktop audit, it was a recommendation to install a temporary flow meter. They did that. They bore the cost of that themselves. They put the flow meter in. It was in for 4 months. And over 4 months, the average return to sewer rate was actually 78%. So the volume that went down the sewer was only 78% of what they took from the mains. The remainder went out of the door as product. They used quite a lot of water in making their products. They had very extensive heating and cooling systems where there were evaporative losses and there were steam leaks. And obviously there was domestic in there as well for canteens and toilet facilities and things like that. And the client was able to secure actually a rebate on that. And the 22% saving over the subsequent years was actually quite a high five-figure sum. This was quite a large client with quite an extensive trade effluent discharge. And that was one of those things that had been kicking around in the client for a number of years. They all knew they needed to do something about it, but the quick turnaround of the desktop audit just gave them that oomph, that bit of a push to actually start looking into it. And the cost of installing a temporary flow meter was dwarfed by the actual saving that they made. Now, this is my favourite ever case study, and I've just noticed that the figure in the bottom right-hand corner seems to have gone a bit funny, so I apologise about that. If we look at the graph first, you'll see there are two vertical red lines between weeks 7 and week 9. And what the graph shows is the average weekly consumption in cubic meters a week. And at some point between week 7 and week 9 on that graph, there was a fairly clear increase in water consumption. Now, those points on that graph, the square markers, are weekly consumption figures. Somebody went round and read the meter once a week, compiled them into a spreadsheet, and that's where the graph comes from. So the weekly increase was something like 30 cubic meters a week. They did actually have automated meter reading on some loggers, and this weekly increase was picked up as part of the desktop audit, and the number one recommendation was go away and look at this. Nobody could really understand where it had come from or what it was. When the site investigated this, what they found was that a bypass had been opened during some maintenance work, and it had been left open. And they'd been doing some work on the main incoming water supply to a particular part of their site, so they'd shut off that pipe that they were working on, but opened a bypass to make sure that that part of the site could be fed with water. When they'd finished doing the work, they opened up the main water supply and forgot to close the bypass. And the excess water was actually going around their water system. It went into a spill tank and ultimately went down the sewer as wastewater. Now, what you can't see from the graph is that that bypass had actually been open for 3 years. So the week 7 and week 9 jump actually happened about 3 years before the desktop audit took place. So this bypass had been open for 3 years and nobody had noticed. And when it was pointed out and when they investigated it, they simply had to go and close the bypass. So the saving on that was completely instantaneous. It was effectively their fault. There was no rebate due. They didn't seek a rebate, but the reduction, and I apologise about the strange formatting in the corner, was actually a 19% reduction in water consumption. This isn't uncommon to see this sort of case study. I did some work on a manufacturing site. It was a pharmaceutical manufacturing site a few years ago, where at one point in the past they had diluted their effluent. And as one of my old managers used to say, dilution is not the solution to pollution. But this is what they had done. And as part of the desktop audit, I noticed there was one particular flow meter, which constantly seemed to be reading, even though there was nothing really happening in that part of the site. And it turned out that was the dilution water. And the dilution water had been simply left running. They were pumping it out of a main, pumping it about 20 meters across a yard, and then it was going back down into a sewer. And it had been running like that for years, and nobody had really noticed until the desktop audit took place. And this is one of the sorts of problems that desktop audits can help you to uncover. So we look at the last case study. I think this is the last one. This client owns a very large office building and it's got several thousand occupants. At any one time, they might have about 3,000 people in the office. It could be a lot more than that. Even on a weekend, they might have 1,500 people in there. Very large office, lots of toilets, there's quite a few canteens, coffee areas. They've got showers on site, they have a gym, they've even got a nursery and a creche. So there's lots of water facilities, lots of water using fixtures and fittings there. The building was fairly new and it had been fitted with the most water efficient taps and systems and urinal controls and shower heads that you could buy. Water consumption was consistently creeping up, and it was felt that this was a behavioural problem and that staff had to be trained about water efficiency. We did the desktop audit. We looked at the list that the client sent about the types of fixtures and fittings that were installed and the numbers of them. What we spotted was that the flush mechanisms on the toilets and the systems were actually very low. Older toilets might be 9 litres of flush, newer ones might be 6. These ones are actually about 3 to 4. Without going into too much detail, and I'll leave this one up to your own imagination, the flow of the toilet wasn't sufficient. So quite a lot of members of staff were actually flushing the toilets 2 or 3 times, whereas in the past they might have just flushed them once. So that was one of the reasons why water consumption was actually going up. The client had done a lot of work and spent a lot of money installing water efficient equipment, but it was too water efficient in effect. So if this flush was 4 litres per flush, and you're flushing it 2 or 3 times, and you're using 8, maybe 12 litres per flush, whereas a 6 litre flush would have been quite sufficient. They also had infrared taps, and the timers on those were too quick. You would put your hand under the tap, the water would come on for maybe 3 or 4 seconds and then go off. And staff were operating them several times to wash their hands. Now, a standard push tap, the sort you get in many establishments, might have a timer on between maybe 20 and 30 seconds. Some staff were quite clearly using these infrared taps far more frequently, and they were actually breaking down quite quickly as well, similarly with the toilet systems. So again, that was one of the reasons why water consumption was creeping up. So this was partly a behavioural problem, but the behaviours had actually come from what was effectively an inappropriate choice of technology. It was a very noble thing that the building operator was trying to do, to fit out the latest water efficient equipment, but a little bit of analysis about how people were actually using it or were going to use it revealed that actually it might not have been the most appropriate thing to do. So what that client is actually doing now, and this is a rolling program which will take many years, is whenever the infrared taps fail, they're replacing them with standard push taps. And whenever the cistern flush mechanisms fail, rather than replacing them with a 4 litre flush, they're replacing them with a 6 litre flush. And this was also another client who had set benchmarks for water consumption, which were actually probably a bit unrealistic. One of the things that came out of the audit was when you look at your long-term data, you average about 38 litres per person per day, which is actually very good for an office. And their target was a lot lower than that. But what the data demonstrated was it was actually going to be very difficult to achieve the aspirational target that the client wanted. And one of the recommendations for the audit was that actually by maybe doing a bit of behavioural work with the people, doing this rolling programme of changing the system mechanisms and the flushes and things like that, would probably help to nudge down the water efficiency a little bit. So you might be able to get down to maybe 35, 36 litres per person per day. But that was actually very good. And the amount of effort it was going to take to get down any lower than that probably wasn't justified by the benefits it would bring. So that is the end of the case studies. I just wanted to add a few last words before we can move into questions, and I can hand back over to Andy. As I said right at the start, this is a quick preliminary assessment of your water state feasibility study. The report that you get, as I said earlier, might be 4 to 10 sides of A4, but it covers lots of ground within that. And its intention is to act either as a status report, as I've said, or as a prompt or a scope or a prelude to a scope for further work. It looks at your billing or site data such as infrastructure, effluent, if you have effluent discharges and rainwater or surface water. And it can act as I've just said, as a standalone piece of work. It could be a precursor to wider investigations. It could be part of investigations into a portfolio of sites. So if you have a large estate, it could be used in that. If you have a large site, just one site, but it's very big, you can do one of these assessments on discrete parts of that site. So for example, I've done work recently with an NHS trust where I've done an audit like this on the laundry, the on-site laundry, with the NHS, that particular NHS trust, and then done a similar exercise in other parts of the site. And it does help to benchmark water use at the site. I think my advice about benchmark data is don't get hung up on single figures. Consider benchmarking more as a sort of a range. If you sit within a range of benchmarks, that is generally easier to achieve than aiming for a single figure. The benchmark data is guidance. It's not an absolute target that you really have to meet, unless, of course, you're looking at building regulations and things like that. But if you have internal targets for water consumption, then consider the benchmarks more as a range or as guidance. And as I mentioned before, it's very important to consider the behaviours and how water is used on site, so you can understand the variability. What sometimes happens is clients get fixated on this single figure, this single benchmark they want to achieve, and they lose sight of the fact that actually people behave in different ways and water consumption can be very variable. Even on sites which have a fairly sort of static operating mode, water can be used quite variably. So the final word before I hand over to Andy and hand over to questions is this is a systematic, structured method giving you a quick evaluation of what your water efficiency opportunities are. And it's auditable. What I mean by auditable is if we use assumptions within the report, and sometimes we have to if there are gaps in the data, then those assumptions come from reliable, auditable sources. And if you then want to take this work and present it, for example, to, let's say, a board of directors, and you want to present it to a board of directors, then you can be confident that the numbers that are in there are sound and they're valid. Or if you want to use it as justification for further investigations, well, this provides a really firm basis for that. So that's effectively it from me in terms of the presentation. Thanks very much for your time. I think what we're going to do now is open this up to questions. So if you post any questions, Andy can relay them to me and I can answer them. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Dave. That was really interesting. Obviously, I get the pleasure of hearing about these as and when they come in, and it's good to hear them again. There's some definite savings out there. We've had a couple of questions come in. This is probably the usual question that we would always get is sort of how much does an audit cost? And I think what we would normally say around that is it is bespoke. One of the things that we want to do is truly understand what it is you're trying to achieve, to base our works on that, because there's no point in just giving you a bog standard audit that doesn't answer the questions that you want. Normally these start from sort of £300 ish, but that, you know, obviously if you've got multiple sites, if it's a huge site, there's a lot of data to go through. If that data perhaps is in PDF bills as opposed to in an Excel spreadsheet, that adds a bit of time. But obviously, if people are interested in taking this further, we can discuss that with you and sort of come up with a price. But basically, £300 ish, and then kind of going up from there, depending on what data you want. The next question that has come through is so what comes next after the desktop audit? So I presume that means once they've done the sort of desktop preliminary, what is the next stages that you can take it onto?
Well, there's any number of stages really. If we take commercial sites, what I would call commercial sites, that could be hotel, office blocks, or if you look at sites like NHS facilities or schools, as and when the current restrictions allow, the next step would potentially be a face-to-face meeting and maybe an on-site audit to go into more detail. So if we take the example of the school I mentioned in Sunderland, where I did a rainwater inspection some years ago, I went in there and I went around the entire school, looked at their fixtures and fittings, looked in detail at how they managed water on site, looked at how they managed their rainwater harvesting system, and that helped to really refine the conclusions of the desktop audit. Now, from there, it can branch out into a number of different areas. Sometimes clients say, look, we're really interested in this rainwater harvesting business. Can you give us some sort of outline design of that? That's perfectly possible. We can do that. We don't do final as-built design, so we don't sort of hand over a set of plans that you can go away and then construct it, but we give you the sort of feasibility study. If you're a manufacturing company, you can then go into what we sometimes call an options report. So if you've got water or trade effluent and you want to understand what the options are for managing either or managing both, we can go into a feasibility study which refines what comes out of the desktop audit, but then gives you much more detail about what the solutions might be. So it could be looking at your heating and cooling system and optimizing that, optimizing blowdown and boilers or blowdown and cooling towers, for example. If it's about trade effluent, it could be how can you manage that within production facilities? Do you have treatment? Can you optimize it? Is it the right sort of treatment? Do you need new treatment? If you do need new treatment, what would it look like? So we can move into that sort of options report as well. So it can go all the way from an initial sort of status report all the way through to a feasibility study, which says this is much more detail about the options. This is what it will look like. This is approximately how big it will be, and this is approximately how much it would cost. So we can take it all the way through from the desktop audit all the way through to a nice detailed assessment of what the options are.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then the last question is, you've mentioned automated meter reading. How do they work? So I suppose, well, one of the good things is I'm actually going to be doing a webinar on that next week. So if people are interested in learning the finer details about AMR, that'll be next Friday at 10:30. But I'll send out meeting invites and things so people can sign up to that one if they wish. And that brings us to the end of our questions, unless there's any more that come through. It doesn't look to be. So just on sort of finals, again, thank you very much for joining me and Dave. We do appreciate you spending the time to listen to us.
We do.
And at the end of this, what will happen is when this closes down, there'll be a short survey. It's only 4 questions. If you wouldn't mind filling that out for us, that would be brilliant. It really does help us kind of understand where we're going with these webinars and hopefully keep bringing you content that's of interest and can help you guys out. And again, this has been recorded, so we will get the video up online. It does take a while. I've got to do it on my home computer. My broadband isn't the best, so it takes me quite a while to actually get it up onto the website. So it'll probably be end of this week, if not the beginning of next week, by the time I've encoded it and got it up there. And just a final reminder, we do actually have a Legionella webinar tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and it's looking at the basics of Legionella compliance. So great if you're new to Legionella and want to kind of understand it from sort of the legislation through to control measures, and a great refresher as well if you're a bit more familiar with that. So again, thank you very much from me and Dave, and
thank
we look
you.
forward to seeing you again. Thank you now.